Okay, with this, I'd like to stop sharing my screen, and I would like to invite Professor Doya to come turn on your screen, and probably you can start sharing your presentation.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak as the first speaker for this EI 2022 conference. I'm very glad with this opportunity. Okay, so let me start to share my screen. So can you see my screen?
Yes, your the screen is perfect. So yeah, thank you very much for agreeing to speak in this conference. So Professor Doya has been one of the most advanced leading researchers in the computational neuroscience, and especially modeling of human brains and neural activities. And I think this is the idea. The reason we invite you for this as a first speaker is actually this is a very central topic of embodied intelligence, and I think this is a perfect topic just to kick off the discussion of embodied intelligence. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kenji for your plenary speech. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for a kind introduction. So today I picked my title as Embodied Engines for Survival, Reproduction, and Prediction, but maybe I will give some more wider background about our research in reinforcement learning. So we are at the Okinawa Institute of Science Technology, so which is a rather new graduate university. So those of you who don't know where is Okinawa, so it is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that 2.5-hour flight from Tokyo. But it can be conveniently visited from many cities in East Asia. So we take this as not the end of Japan, but the center of kind of Southeast Asia. And then we hope that many people, not only tourists, but also students and researchers to come to this new university. So the feature of our university is to make it very international and interdisciplinary. But our university is still quite small. So if you take statistics and divide by the head count, the result can be quite variable. And then the last time it happened to be that the Nature Index listed as our world number 9, slightly above Stanford and MIT. So, but anyway, I hope this kind of a trend continues in the future. And our lab is called the Neural Computation Unit, and it was one of the first lab in OST. So I tried to make my own lab interdisciplinary place. And one target is to create flexible learning machines. And another target is review the brain's mechanisms for learning. So on one side, we do robotics and machine learning experiments, and we also do neurobiology experiments using mostly rats and mice. But our common theme in these lines of studies is reinforcement learning. As many of you know, this is the framework for an agent, which can be human or animal, or a robot or software, to monitor the state of the environment and sense an action, and then get the reward feedback. And the aim of the reinforcement learning agent is to learn action policy to maximize the reward acquired. And then coming up with the efficient and robust algorithm for reinforcement learning is a very important topic in artificial intelligence. And also finding out the neural circuit and the possibly molecular mechanism of reinforcement learning in the brain is a very important topic in neuroscience. So that's why we do these line of studies in parallel. If you make one progress in one side, maybe that will give you some insight to the other side. Right? So that's the idea. So and we have been applying the reinforcement learning framework to different kinds of robot. So this is a quite old work, but still a favorite example to explain what is reinforcement learning. So this is a robot about 70 centimeter high, And then we wanted this robot to learn to stand up, right? So, and initially the robot makes a kind of a random exploration, and we gave a reward feedback based on the height of the head from the floor. And when it fell down, we gave a negative reward or punishment. And through many trials and errors, these robots could finally find out this kind of a nice trajectory for standing up. Yeah, one important aspect of this kind of learning is that this is one of the delayed reward tasks, right? So initially, the robot keeps his head on the floor. So in this phase, the reward is 0. But by pushing his weight on the foot, he can subsequently stand up. So how to find a good behavior despite such a delayed reward is a very important topic in reinforcement learning. And also important in reinforcement learning is the design of the reward function. So we gave a positive reward for the height of the head, but is this a linear function of the height or somewhere, or the Gaussian or so on? That kind of a setting affects learning performance. And also the balance between reward and punishment is very important. For example, if you take this punishment too large, robot may end up just lying down to avoid any punishment. That's not something you want, right? So, and how to cope with the delayed reward, and also how to set up the right reward function, they are kind of meta level important problem, right? And in reinforcement learning, there are several key computations. One is the prediction of the future reward in the form of a value function. So VS is a state value function, a prediction of the future reward. This E is an expectation over the stochasticity of the environment and the action policy. And here the gamma is called a discounter factor. So if gamma is 0, you just focus on the immediate outcome. And with larger setting gamma, you take into account longer delayed outcome. And this is called the action value function, goodness of the taking a certain action at a given state. And then based on such a reward prediction, you will actually take an action. So for example, if you have a perfect action value function, you can choose an action which maximizes the action value function for the given state, which is called a greedy action selection. So earlier in learning, you would perform a stochastic search for action. So in that case, what is popularly used is so-called Boltzmann or softmax action selection, in which this action value is taken as a negative energy. So the action with the higher action value is selected with a higher probability. Here, beta is called the inverse temperature, which controls the exploration and exploitation. If beta is 0, you take all the actions with equal probability, and as the beta increase, any small difference in the action values are expanded, so the action choice becomes more greedy. And then after taking action, you learn from the outcome. So the criterion for learning is called temporal difference error, which is the difference between the cumulative reward you predicted before taking action and the reward you received after action, and also we further predict from the subsequent state, discounted by gamma. If your prediction is perfect, they cancel out for the 0 error. But if not, you will update your previous prediction of reward in proportion to this temporal difference error. And here, alpha is a learning rate, which consider the trade-off between the flexibility and the stability of your learning. So, and then how to implement these steps more efficiently and reliably is a very important topic in reinforcement learning. For example, recent progress in application of reinforcement learning is based on the successful use of the deep neural network for approximation of a value function. And also important is the setting of these parameters, like temporal discounting or inverse temperature or learning rate. So the proper setting of these parameters depending on the environment and the task. So even if your algorithm is perfect, with the bad choice of the parameters, your performance is not very good. So we often spend a lot of time fine-tuning these parameters, but how to make them more automatic, which is a very important topic. And then these are important topic in engineering, but also we think these are important topic for neuroscience as well. Our brain may not be using exactly the same equation, but something like a prediction and action selection, and then learning from the result is our brain should be doing. So how our brain implement these computation for value computation, action selection, and the learning from the outcome, that is very important topic. And also how our brain controls these parameters. Our brain can learn different behaviors in a very different environments. So there should be some kind of a automatic regulation mechanism for these parameters, which is a very important topic in neuroscience as well. So regarding the implementation of reinforcement learning, we postulate that the basal ganglia, which is hidden under the cerebral cortex, plays a very important role. Right? So the basal ganglia makes a loop circuit between the cortex and the thalamus. So the input site of the basal ganglia is called the striatum, which is known to receive a strong dopaminergic input. And the dopamine has been shown to be involved in the reward processing. And more recently, it has been specifically shown to represent the temporal difference error. And this is a more engineering view of this cortical basal ganglia circuit. And then the dopamine neurons project most strongly to the striatum. And our colleague, Jeff Wickens, has shown that the synapse linking the cortex and the basal ganglia has a particular form of plasticity called dopamine-dependent synaptic plasticity. So that places the striatum a very good position to perform reinforcement learning. And for example, the neurons which project to the pallidum and the cortex to takes this kind of loop may be involved in action selection by learning action value function. And the neurons, some of the neurons also project to dopamine neurons, and they may be involved in state value function learning. So, fortunately, using recent developments in molecular biology, we can test those hypotheses in experimental manner. So recently, the stereotype selective neural recording is made possible by choosing a particular promoter for the particular type of neurons and expressing the calcium sensors in the particular type of neurons. So this is the mouse line which allows us to express the calcium sensors selectively in the neurons that project to the dopamine neurons. And my former PhD student, Tomohiko, implanted endoscope and monitored activities of these neurons while the animal was involved in reinforcement learning. And then he showed, after learning to associate the odor cue with the water reward, so these neurons started to show the predictive activity before the reward is actually presented. So such a result is consistent with the hypothesis that those neurons in the striatum that project to the dopamine neurons learn to encode a state value function. Right. And then actually there are multiple types of algorithms in reinforcement learning. So one is called the model-free paradigm. So in which we assume no knowledge of the agent about the world, and then they simply learn the state action value function from the sequence of state action reward experience. Right? So, and then for a given state, they select an action in a reactive way. So the algorithm is very simple, but this naive reinforcement learning would require many experiences for proper learning of the behavior. So another type is called model-based strategy. So in this case, agents learn the action-dependent state transition model. Such an internal model allows the kind of internal simulation before taking a physical action. And for example, you can estimate the current state based on the past observation of states and execution of action, which is helpful in a noisy environment. And you can also use such a model forward in time to plan ahead, write action sequence to reach to the desired state. So this model-based strategy takes internal processing, something like a deliberation, before taking a physical action. So the internal computation is hard, heavy, but it can learn behavior from a fewer actual interaction with the environment. So whether to use the free strategy or model-based strategy, which is a very important topic in choice of the learning architecture in reinforcement learning, and how humans and animals use model-free or model-based strategy, which is also a very important topic. So some people call this side is a kind of system 1 and this side like system 2. So we often make an intuitive choice or a more deliberate choice. What is our mechanism of the brain for allowing it? That's a very fascinating question. And also something like model-based strategy is how they are implemented in the brain is also very interesting topic in the neuroscience. So this is one example of model-based reinforcement learning by my former PhD student Parmas, who is now like assistant professor at the Kyoto University. So this is a task of bouncing up and balance using a smartphone-based robot. So initially, the robot makes a kind of a random movement, but while doing this kind of behavior, the robot makes a model of how the body responds to the wheel movement. And they use such an internal model to run offline optimization of the controller. So then within less than 10 trials, the robot could acquire this kind of a bounce and balance behavior. So this is one example of the data efficiency of model-based strategy. And then when the animals and humans perform a kind of a model-based strategy, we can call it a kind of a mental simulation. Right? So we can define mental simulation as a brain processing using action-dependent state transition model, either deterministic one or stochastic one. Right? So using such like an internal model, we can estimate the present state from the past state and action. So which is very helpful when the state is not directly observable, occluded by the noise or certain delays. And also you can use such action-dependent state transition model for action planning to reach to the desired state. And we can apply such a model to arbitrary situation if you have a sufficient working memory capability. So you can basically run thought experiments about what could happen and what is a good thing to do. Right? So for example, use of language is depending on our capability for imagination and manipulating certain mental state based on the kind of a simulation of the world. And also the producing theory of science requires a thought experiments in the initial phase before actually running physical experiments. So I think mental simulation is a very important brain function, starting from the sensory motor control to higher cognitive functions. But how our brain store something like action state transition model, how we run the simulation in the brain, which is still not very well understood. So I think it's a very important target of research in the neuroscience. And probably this mental simulation is somewhat related to the functions like consciousness. And then the neuroscience of consciousness also very fascinating. But the problem is that you have to start with arguing what is consciousness for days or years, right? So the mental simulation can be better defined as a process using action-dependent state transition model. So it can be verified more precisely in experiments and analyzed mathematically. So for example, this is the brain imaging work we performed several years ago. So this is the game in the grid world. So you move this cursor from this position to the goal position. But to make this game interesting, we limited the movement of the cursor to only 3 among 8 directions, right, by the pressing of the one of the 3 buttons. Right. So finding path to the certain direction is complicated. You have to find this kind of zigzag path to the target. So we call it the kind of grid sailing task. This is something similar to the sailboat going upwind. Right? So, and finding this kind of path just by random search is very difficult. But once you learn action-dependent state transition model, you can find such paths relatively efficiently. And then before the MRI scanning, we asked the subjects to pre-learn such action-dependent state transition model. And inside the scanner, we presented a new target. And then before the subjects start to press the keys, we gave a delay time or thinking time up to 6 seconds. And from the subject's behavior, we could verify that the subjects indeed benefited from this delay time. So the subjects were utilizing the action-dependent state transition model internally before actually performing physical movements. And then we addressed what is the brain circuit which supports such a mental simulation. So we found activities in the cortical areas like parietal cortex, premotor cortex, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So they were known to be involved in like spatial processing or action sequence or visual working memory. But it was not only the cortex, but also subcortical circuit, like some part of the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, which are known to link to these areas, were also activated. So our results suggest that the kind of a whole brain circuit is involved in mental simulation. And our further interpretation is that the cortex and the basal ganglia and cerebellum provide a distinct mechanism for mental simulation. So we earlier proposed that the cerebellum is a circuit specialized for supervised learning based on the error signal, which is very helpful for learning internal model of a state transition. And then basal ganglia, as we already told, seems to have a very important role in reward-driven reinforcement learning, for example, learning value function. And then the cerebral cortex may not have a specific teaching signal like error or reward, but it has been known to be capable of unsupervised learning to detect important features in the sensory inputs for the representation learning. And also the cerebral cortex is shown to have a mechanism for working memory. So our idea is that for a given state, some candidate action is used to predict the resulting state. And then the basal ganglia is used to evaluate such a state. And if the evaluation is good enough, you take the action, and otherwise you can come up with other candidates. So that's how the cortex and the basal ganglia and the cerebellum would be involved in the mental simulation. Right? And we are hoping to apply some kind of a brain decoding study to actually prove that. But we still have a very important question. So we showed that the different parts of the brain are activated for a given task, like a grid setting task. But how can these modules with different functions are activated and properly connected? So the many of the functional MRI study assumes that the brain areas that perform a required computation for given tasks are activated. And then based on such activation, we write a paper and make a living. But we still don't know why such a required brain parts are properly activated and connected. That's a very fascinating and then a very enigmatic problem. So in the forebrain, how to select and connect right modules is also a very important question in macroscopic level. So there are like a computational models of modular learning. So for example, I collaborate with Mitsuo Kawato and Daniel Woppert about the architecture called mosaic architecture, which uses the prediction error of the prediction models to select the right modules. So we extended that framework for the reinforcement learning using a Bellman error. And there are other ideas like using of uncertainty to select the right module. And also interesting is how the different modules are selected and connected biophysically. So the basal ganglia may be used not for selecting action, but selection of the modules. And also the Georgian one and the colleagues show the interesting framework that the different types of inhibitory interneurons in the cortex will be used for selective activation and deactivation of the inputs and outputs. So these are very interesting topic to be studied in the future. Okay, so let me shift my gear to the topic of how to tune these parameters of reinforcement learning. So this is an example of a battery catching task for a robot. This robot finds the battery pack and then go approach and get the big reward. And by learning, he can move to the target more smoothly. And then the robot on this side was initially making a random movement, but learned to be just stay still, even though this robot can see this battery pack. Right. So we are wondering why this robot is so depressed. This is go to the reward only when it is very, very close. The reason was the setting of this temporal discounting parameter. So if the gamma is small, gamma square, the gamma 2 cube converges very quickly to 0. So there's almost no reward, no weight for the delayed reward. So if they take a certain cost, the entire aberration can be negative. So it's not worth taking. So that you can find a depressed like robot. But that is also not always the case. So if your action is associated with immediate reward, but the big punishment in the future, you cannot evaluate this big punishment and then cannot resist the temptation. So it can result in impulsive behavior. So from this picture, you may think that the gamma is larger the better, but in fact, if the gamma is too large, you try to predict the long future, so learning becomes more challenging. So the gamma has to be large enough, but not too large. So we often end up tuning the discounting parameter to be 0.9 or 0.99 or 0.999 or so on. So, and then now we also are interested in how such a temporal discounting or balance between immediate and delayed reward is regulated in the brain. And we came to the hypothesis that the serotonin plays an important role in temporal discounting. So one intuition behind that many of the drugs used for the therapy of depression enhance serotonin transmission. So maybe that brings the brain in this state back to this healthy state. And then in addition to serotonin, we came up with a hypothesis that the different neuromodulators which project diffusely from the brainstem to the wide areas in the brain may be regulating the global parameters of reinforcement learning. For example, learning rate or inverse temperature or temporal discounting. Right. So we focused on the serotonin and then saw how they are involved. And most recently, we can use the method called optogenetics to selectively stimulate or suppress a certain type of neurons. And this mouse expresses the light-sensitive molecules called channel rhodopsin selectively in the serotonin neurons. And then he's waiting for the food pellet with a delay of 3, 6, 9, or infinity seconds. So as you increase the delay, the mouse often abundance, but such an error is decreased with the serotonin stimulation by the blue light. And then infinity or reward omission trials, mouse usually abundance after 10 seconds, but with the serotonin stimulation, they can wait much longer. So this is consistent with the hypothesis that serotonin is involved in the regulation of temporal discounting or the wait for the delayed reward. And then we also tried to implement such adaptation of temporal discounting in robots as well. But there's a big problem. So in the standard framework of reinforcement learning, the temporal discounting parameter is within the objective function. Then if you want to manipulate the objective function, you have to have some kind of a higher level goal. And that's why we end up with building the robots called cyber rodents. So we try to ask the origin of the reward and also the objective function like the temporal discounting. So to address the reward function optimization, we have to set up a certain higher level goal. So we want to make these robots biologically relevant. So we thought about what is the biological origin of the reward. So our conclusion was that they should be linked with self-preservation and self-reproduction. So this robot can keep moving by catching the battery pack, and also they can reproduce in software by copying the program or parameters of program by infrared communication. So this is a movie from our demo several years ago in Kagaku Miraikan in Tokyo. So they catch a battery and also after they are well charged, they look for mating partner and then they are copying the parameters of the program. So on top of this kind of hardware, we implemented like embodied evolution framework. So upon each hardware robot, we hosted multiple virtual agents, and they have their genes, so representing the innate behaviors by a kind of neural network, and also the parameters for the reward function and the parameters of reinforcement learning, including temporal discounting. Right? So, and then when they exchange the parameters, so the probability of a usage of these parameters in the next generation is based on how good each agent is charged. So this is a kind of selection mechanism. And we also implemented some random mutation to these parameters to implement like an embodied evolution framework. And we combined actual physical experiments and the simulation. And then in this robot, the catching the battery pack and also successful mating is an obvious source of reward. But from that primary reward alone, it's very difficult for the robots to learn the behavior. For example, we have the reward systems like smells and taste, so which attract us to nutritious objects more certainly. Without such a guide, maybe we would end up starving before finding a nutritious things put into our mouth. Right? So, and this robot has a visual reward function. So depending on the angle and distance of the battery pack in the view, we give a reward, but the shape of the reward was initially random. And through evolution, we could verify that the robots could evolve the reward function, which is highest in the center of the view and closer to the robot. And this robot also has a visual reward for the face of another robot. So, and after learning, it acquired this kind of a profile because the infrared communication is easier to do at certain distance. These are the different profile. Right? So from this experiment, we could verify that robots colony can acquire their own reward function through distribute embodied evolution on the basis of reproduction and survival. We didn't implement any explicit fitness function, but the robots that charge frequently and mate frequently just as left more upstream to be stabilized. And we could also see that different parameters of reinforcement can evolve over time. For this temporal discounting parameter gamma grew very close to 1 after evolution. And then in this kind of experiment, sometimes you find unexpected behaviors. So in some of the colonies, the postdoc who did it, Stefan Elfing, found heterogeneity in the behavior. So interesting situation is when the robot finds a battery pack on one side and another robot on the other side. And some of the robots always go to the battery, and other robots keep track of the another robot to seek the mating opportunity. And then Stefan performed a gene analysis of these robots and indeed found a bimodal distribution. And those green agents start mating only when almost fully charged. And those red agents start mating even when they are half charged to seek more opportunity for mating. And actually, Stefan could show that these two types can coexist stably at the evolutionarily stable point with the right mixture. So, this shows that with the embodied evolution, we can see different strategies where it can be like a kind of a gender or subspecies that can emerge within the initially homogeneous colony. So, and then so far we have discussed the evolution of the reward based on the very basic needs for life, like survival and reproduction. But in higher animals, something like information also appears to take a reward value. We are curious to know something new, and we pay a lot of money for buying books or watching movies and so on. Right? And then probably such acquisition reward allow us to better understand the world and better direct our learning. Right? And then there's a lot of study going on about the computational theory of curiosity. So in the like a model-free framework, so we have worked on something like a supplemental reward that could be based on the information gain. And we often set up the optimistic initial value to promote a visit to a new state or action. And then the setting higher temperature also promote random search, but this is not kind of a directed one. So in the model-based framework, so we want to help learning internal models, and then the clarifying the uncertainty or also the progress of the learning of these internal model could be a source of theoretical reasoning for the curiosity. Right. So and then the one of my former student, Shok Ota, actually worked on the humans features of a curiosity by designing different variants of a game of life, and then see what kind of games the subjects like. And her results suggest that having a high level of variability using a relatively simple rule make the game most interesting to the subjects. And then also we are having working on the framework of inverse reinforcement learning together with Eiji Uchebe, so to extract the reward function from human behaviors. And then finally, those cyber rodent robots became too old to move, but we are now developing a new platform based on the smartphone, which has a very high performance computer and a lot of sensors. So we can make affordable robots using like a 3D printer to make the body. And it is using an internal accelerometer to do the balancing act. And we are also letting these robots to go to the charging station and also implement software reproduction. So you can use the Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, but then it is hard to tell what's happening. So we are using a QR code to show some kind of a secret genetic code to another agent. And then such a genotype is copied. For example, in this case, the policy for the balancing was encoded in gene. So on top of this kind of a platform, we are going to address the topics like how to learn the models of the world on other agents, and how to implement meta-learning, like tuning the parameters of reinforcement learning, and then the evolution of the reward function, including the reward for the information for better prediction. Okay, so and that is the kind of things we have been working on, and then I would like to thank my collaborators who made this kind of work possible. And finally, I want to tell you that we are going to host the joint conference of neuroscience, neurochemistry, and neural network societies in Okinawa in this summer. So we are going to call for like additional late-breaking abstract in the April. So we hope many more people can come visit Okinawa to further discuss the mechanism of learning and then the flexible adaptation in the brain and in artificial agents. Thank you very much for your attention and the patience.